Millions of people along the East Coast are being told to prepare, right now, for 10 days that forecasters are calling genuinely dangerous. Not just hot, not just uncomfortable. Dangerous enough that emergency officials are already opening cooling centers before the worst of it even arrives. So what exactly is coming, and why are meteorologists so unusually alarmed this time? If you care about staying ahead of major weather stories before they hit your area, hit subscribe now, because we cover exactly this kind of forecast every single week. The core of the problem is something meteorologists call a heat dome. It sounds almost harmless when you say it out loud, but it is one of the most dangerous weather patterns in the country. A heat dome forms when a massive area of high pressure builds up in the atmosphere and essentially traps hot air underneath it, like a lid pressed down over a pot. The air can't rise, it can't escape. It just keeps getting hotter day after day, with almost nowhere for that heat to go. This particular heat dome has already made headlines once this summer. Around the 4th of July, it scorched the middle of the country and then pushed into the East Coast, breaking all-time heat records in cities that rarely see numbers like this. Atlantic City, New Jersey, hit an all-time record high. Newark reached the low hundreds. Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York's. Central Park all set daily records, with Central Park touching the triple digits for the first time in nearly 14 years. That was round one. Now forecasters say round two is arriving, and this next stretch could be just as intense, if not more disruptive, because of how it's expected to interact with something else moving in at the same time. Here's where it gets serious. Like this video right now, if you didn't realize just how connected these weather systems really are, meteorologists are watching two things converge over the East Coast in the coming days. The first is this redeveloping heat dome, again centered over the central United States, again pushing its outer edges toward the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. Forecasters expect temperatures to push into the upper 90s and touch 100 degrees in major cities, including Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C., with heat index values, what the temperature actually feels like when humidity is factored in, climbing as high as 105 to 110 degrees in some spots. The second factor is moisture. Tropical and subtropical moisture has been streaming into the east, partly fed by disturbances in the Gulf, and partly by the sheer amount of humid air being pulled northward ahead of the heat dome. When that much moisture collides with a boundary of cooler air pushing in from the north, it doesn't just create clouds, it creates fuel for severe thunderstorms, torrential, rainfall, and flash flooding, often erupting with very little warning. That combination, extreme heat on one side and explosive storm potential on the other, is exactly why forecasters are treating the next 10 days as a two-front battle, rather than a single simple heat wave. Let's talk about the heat itself first, because it isn't just about feeling sweaty for a few days. Extreme heat is, statistically, the deadliest weather phenomenon in the United States. It kills more people every year than hurricanes, tornadoes, and flooding combined. And what makes this round particularly worrying to meteorologists is the humidity. When dew points climb into the 70s, the air becomes so saturated with moisture that sweat can't evaporate off your skin efficiently. Your body's natural cooling system essentially stops working the way it's supposed to. Add in overnight temperatures that barely drop, and you get almost no recovery period for people without reliable air conditioning. Some meteorologists have started describing this pattern as a steam cooker effect. Air so thick and humid that stepping outside feels less like standing in the sun and more like stepping into a sauna that never turns off. Extreme heat warnings and heat advisories have already stretched across a huge swath of the country, from the northern plains through the Midwest and into the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. Tens of millions of people have been placed under major or extreme heat risk classifications by the National Weather Service, meaning health. The impacts aren't just possible, they're expected, especially for children, the elderly, outdoor workers, and anyone without consistent access to cooling. Don't forget to subscribe before we get into the second half of this forecast, because what happens when this heat starts to break is arguably even more dangerous than the heat itself. As the heat dome eventually begins to weaken and shift, it doesn't just fade away quietly. Meteorologists say the edges of a collapsing heat dome are often where the most violent thunderstorms form, because that's where the sharpest temperature contrasts exist in the atmosphere. Forecasters are specifically watching the Great Lakes, interior Northeast, and Mid-Atlantic for storms capable of producing damaging straight-line winds, large hail, and even isolated tornadoes as this pattern evolves. New England in particular has been flagged as an area of concern, with meteorologists warning that any storms moving through could be unusually strong for the region, capable of downing trees and power lines. That matters more than it might sound like at first, because losing electricity during a heat wave isn't just inconvenient. For people relying on air conditioning or medical equipment at home, a multi-hour power outage during dangerous heat can quickly become a genuine emergency. At the same time, The Weather Prediction Center has already flagged parts of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast for an elevated risk of excessive rainfall and flash flooding as repeated rounds of thunderstorms move through over the next several days. Slow. Moving storms are the biggest concern here. When a thunderstorm stalls over the same neighborhood for even 30 or 40 minutes, it can dump an enormous amount of rain in a very short window, overwhelming storm drains and turning streets and underpasses into fast-moving water with little warning. This is the part forecasters keep emphasizing. It's not just one hazard. It's heat, followed by storms, followed by flooding risk, layered back-to-back over a 10-day window, with the potential for the pattern to repeat more than once as fresh rounds of heat and moisture cycle through the region. If this is the kind of forecast breakdown, because we're tracking the system daily as new model data comes in. There's also a broader climate context worth understanding here, because meteorologists keep bringing it up for a reason. Scientists studying long-term weather patterns have noted that heat waves in general are becoming more frequent, more intense, and longer-lasting nationwide, a trend they connect to a warming global climate. One meteorologist put it simply. The baseline is warmer now, so when a heat dome or a high-pressure system sets up, it's already starting from a hotter floor than it would have decades ago. That helps explain why numbers that once felt like rare, historic extremes are starting to show up more than once in the same summer. It's also worth noting that this year's atmospheric backdrop includes a strong El Niño pattern, which tends to influence storms, tracks, and moisture transport across North America. While El Niño years often mean a quieter Atlantic hurricane season overall, they don't prevent intense, homegrown storm systems from developing right along the coastline, fueled by warm ocean water and abundant atmospheric moisture. Exactly the kind of setup meteorologists are watching unfold right now. So, what does this actually mean if you live anywhere from the mid-Atlantic up through New England over the next 10 days? Expect the first several days to be dominated by dangerous heat, with highs near or above 100 degrees in major metro areas and heat index values well beyond that. Outdoor plans during peak afternoon hours carry real health risks, particularly for vulnerable groups. Expect that heat to gradually give way, not to relief, but to a stretch of unsettled storm-prone weather, with the potential for damaging wind gusts, hail, and flash flooding, especially in urban areas and low-lying neighborhoods. And expect forecasters to keep adjusting the exact timing because a pattern this active, involving both a heat dome and tropical moisture at the same time, remains genuinely difficult to pin down more than a few days in advance. That uncertainty is actually one of the more honest parts of this story. Meteorologists aren't claiming to know the exact hour storms will roll through your specific town. What they are confident about is the overall pattern: extreme heat, followed by an unusually active and potentially dangerous stretch of storms, both driven by the same converging systems. For anyone in the path of this forecast, the guidance from meteorologists is fairly consistent. Take extreme heat warnings seriously, even if you feel like you've handled D heat waves before. Check on elderly neighbors and relatives who might not have reliable air conditioning. Have a plan for sudden intense thunderstorms, including knowing which parts of your area are prone to flash flooding. And pay attention to updated forecasts daily, because a pattern this dynamic can shift its timeline with very little notice. There's something almost fitting about how this particular 10-day stretch is unfolding. It isn't one dramatic, single-day disaster. It's a slow building sequence, heat stacking onto P of heat, then colliding with sudden bursts of violent weather, each hazard setting up the conditions for the next. That's exactly why meteorologists across multiple forecasting agencies are speaking with unusual unity right now. This isn't ordinary summer weather. It's a multi-stage event, and it's only just getting started. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because the specifics really do matter here. Meteorologists tracking this pattern say the core of the heat dome will initially sit over the north-central United States, the same region that saw temperatures reach 115 degrees in parts of Montana just days earlier. From there, the outer edges of that same high-pressure system are forecast to stretch eastward, first pushing triple-digit heat into the Dakotas and toward New Hampshire, before searing conditions arrive across the mid-Atlantic shortly after. That timing matters because it gives forecasters a rough blueprint for how the heat will move city by city. New York City is expected to approach the upper 90s, potentially flirting with daily records depending on how far east the hottest air pushes. Philadelphia is forecast to hit around 100 degrees, with the heat index pushing conditions to feel closer to 105. Washington, D.C. and Baltimore are both expected to see similar numbers, with humidity dragging the feels-like temperature well past the actual thermometer reading. Meanwhile, states further inland, including parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and even sections of the Midwest that already baked through record heat earlier this month, are being placed under extreme heat warnings once again. That's an important detail. This isn't a brand new hazard appearing out of nowhere. It's the same underlying weather engine cycling back through many of the same communities for a second, sometimes third, round this summer. Now let's shift to the storm side of this forecast, because that's where a lot of the day-to-day uncertainty comes from. As the heat dome begins to weaken along its northern and eastern edges, meteorologists expect increasingly frequent rounds of thunderstorms to fire up, particularly from the Great Lakes into New England. These storms form specifically because the temperature contrast at the boundary of a heat dome tends to be sharp, and sharp temperature contrasts are exactly what fuels strong, sometimes severe convection. Meteorologists have specifically flagged the risk of damaging straight-line winds capable of snapping tree limbs and knocking down power lines, along with large hail and a low but real risk of isolated tornadoes, particularly across interior sections of the Northeast. Forecasters have also pointed to a repeating pattern of frontal boundaries draped across the mid-Atlantic and Ohio Valley, each one capable of triggering its own round of thunderstorms as it slides through. Because the atmosphere over this region will remain unusually moisture-rich for days at a time, any storm that develops has the potential to produce very heavy rainfall rates, sometimes an inch or more per hour, which is more than enough to overwhelm storm drains in urban areas like Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C. The National Weather Service's weather portions of the northern mid-Atlantic and southern New England for an elevated risk of flash flooding on multiple days within this 10-day window. That means residents in low-lying neighborhoods, areas near small streams, and anyone who's experienced flooding during past summer storms should treat this as a recurring risk rather than a single isolated event. Here's something else worth understanding about why this pattern feels unusually persistent. A broad, strong El Niño is currently influencing global weather patterns this year. And while El Niño years tend to suppress overall hurricane formation in the Atlantic, they can still allow smaller homegrown tropical disturbances to develop close to shore, exactly where warm coastal waters and abundant atmospheric moisture already exist. Forecasters have been closely monitoring exactly this kind of disturbance, forming near the Gulf and southeast coastlines throughout the season, and even without an officially named storm, that tropical moisture can still feed directly into the same storm systems moving up the east coast. In other words, you don't necessarily need a hurricane or a tropical storm to get hurricane-level rainfall rates. You just need the right amount of tropical moisture streaming into an already unstable atmosphere, which is precisely the setup meteorologists are describing for the coming days. So let's bring this back to something practical. What should people actually watch for, day by day, over roughly the next week and a half? Early on, expect the heat to be the dominant, most immediate danger, especially during afternoon hours when temperatures peak. Meteorologists strongly recommend limiting strenuous outdoor activity, staying hydrated, well before you feel thirsty, and checking in on elderly relatives or neighbors, since older adults are disproportionately affected by extreme heat, often without realizing how quickly symptoms can escalate. As the pattern transitions, watch for sudden shifts in the sky, darkening clouds, a rapid drop in temperature, or a noticeable increase in wind, all of which can signal a fast, developing thunderstorm. Because some of these storms are expected to move quickly and organize with little advance notice, having a weather alert system active on your phone is one of the simplest ways to get warned in time to take shelter. And throughout the entire window, flooding remains a quiet but serious risk, particularly at night when visibility is lower and people are less likely to notice rising water until it's already surrounding their vehicle. Meteorologists consistently repeat the same warning every time flash flooding becomes a concern. Never drive through a flooded roadway, even if it looks shallow, because it takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a car off the road. Local governments in several major cities have already begun opening cooling centers ahead of the worst of the heat, a sign of just how seriously officials are treating this stretch. Emergency management agencies are also urging residents to prepare go bags and charge devices in advance of potential power outages, particularly in areas expected to see the strongest thunderstorm winds. What makes meteorologists most cautious right now isn't any single number on a forecast map, it's the layering. Extreme heat stresses the body, storms threaten the power grid that keeps air conditioning running, and flooding threatens transportation and infrastructure, right? As communities are trying to recover from days of oppressive heat. Each hazard on its own is manageable. Stacked back to back, they become something forecasters are treating with real, sustained concern. If you found this forecast breakdown helpful, hit like, subscribe for daily updates as the system develops, and drop a comment letting me know what conditions look like where you are right now. Stay safe out there, and we'll keep tracking this one closely.